This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, it's been about 2 years since my book Uncontrollable came out, and about 2 years since an interview with Yoshua Bengio came out, so we thought we'd rerun it because it's still a good interview. In the past couple years, Dr. Bengio's profile has exploded. He's become far more known around the world for various types of things, different initiatives, different intergovernmental panels. He's now the first scholar in Google Scholar that has over 1 million citations.
First scholar or first AI scholar to reach 1 million?
First scientist of any type.
Very impressive.
Possible first human. Not to say there's an AI that's done it, but it's the first person. Yeah. He's also started a new project called Law Zero. As well, in 2024, Time magazine included Yoshua Bengio in its yearly list of 100 most influential people globally. And recently, he was awarded the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering. This is jointly with several other individuals. As well, this year, he was a recipient of an honorary doctorate from McGill and was made an officer of the National Order of Quebec.
Excellent.
Please enjoy this interview with Dr. Yoshua Bengio. Today we have with us Yoshua Bengio, who's a professor in the Department of Computer Science and Operations Research at the Université de Montréal, as well as the scientific director of the Montreal Institute for Learning Algorithms, otherwise known as MILA. Welcome, Yoshua.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Well, you have accomplished a lot in your life, and there's a lot going on in the world of AI. I thought we would first, though, go way back when you were just a younger man getting into this field. Tell us about, 80s, 90s, when you started to be most interested in computers, and what was driving your interest?
Well, I was a fan of science fiction well before I got into university. And so that's how I got acquainted with AI. And then I did my computer science undergrad, and I started my master's not knowing what I would do. But by chance, I started reading all kinds of papers in computer science and got to read some of the early papers by Jeff Hinton, David Rumelhart, and others who created the connectionist movement, which are like the early days of neural nets with backprop and the Boltzmann machine. So this is really the building blocks of what we're seeing today. And I read those papers and I got really excited because they were really talking about not just building AI, but understanding intelligence, understanding the brain. And I thought that the idea that we might understand intelligence using a few simple principles, just like we understand physics, was so incredible. I mean, if it turned out to be true and exciting, that I was really enthusiastic, and I'm still enthusiastic, except I now see potential problems as well.
Right. So it is interesting, like how to understand the world at all, right? And we try to understand the human brain in one way, and now we've created artificial systems, some say sort of inspired by or mimicking. I guess that's a question. Do you see neural networks or artificial neural networks that drives a lot of the AI stuff nowadays very similar to the human brain, loosely inspired by the human brain? How do you conceptualize that?
Clearly not mimicking, and clearly inspired by the human brain, but also taking all sorts of information into account. We have mathematical formalisms. We've got understanding of questions of optimization, statistics, probability, and also it's not just the brain as in neuroscience, but it's the brain as in cognitive science, behavior. So all kinds of ideas have come into building the kind of neural nets that we improved over the last few decades.
When you were doing your work, I guess, how did it feel? Was there much of a shift in terms of the field in the 90s and 2000s? Because sometimes people talk about different AI winters, whether there was more or less research funding or excitement about things. And I wondered what your experience was going through all this over a long period of time.
So when I started, which is 1985, 1986, there was very little going on in terms of neural nets. I took an AI class, and it was all about what we now call good old-fashioned AI, so symbolic AI, logic, deterministic systems. And so I don't think there was a lot of funding for neural nets, but there had been, of course, a previous wave of neural net research from the late 50s to the end of the 60s. That's the time of Rosenblatt and the perceptron and so on. Mm-hmm. And after the kind of early excitement that I and others felt for neural nets in the mid-'80s, there was a rapid growth of the community of people interested in this. Still a small fraction of the total AI research. But by the mid-'90s, the enthusiasm for neural nets were starting to decrease in favor of other machine learning methods. So not going back to the classical AI, but other machine learning methods like kernel methods. And by the early 2000s, it was pretty difficult to publish neural net work, and there was maybe less interest, but nonetheless, people like Jeff Hinton, Yann LeCun, and I were able to get funding for our academic research and continued on that path. And then, of course, after our advances in the mid-2000s with deep learning, the first successes at training deeper neural nets, the companies started to understand that, this could be useful by 2010. And after that, it's been just an exponential acceleration.
Sure enough. It's kind of interesting to almost see machine learning or deep learning as its own sort of biography, as its own story. And it's like the underdog in some ways, and now it's coming up on top. And at one point in history, sometimes it's hard to see just how different things might be. It certainly has been quite a dramatic shift or change in the machine learning community, as well as from people on the outside, like ourselves, who are just sort of very much surprised by the results. And I guess then maybe if you can, we'll do a little bit more history here, taking us up from the early 2010s, sort of to the late, or maybe 2020, where it does seem like, as you said, progress is happening. There's amazing achievements in image recognition and other things. And then we start to shift into even more capabilities.
So maybe I'm going to go back slightly more. And sure. In 2000, I published at NeurIPS the neural language model paper, then in a journal in 2003, GMLR. And it was, for the time, one of the biggest neural nets, of course, tiny compared to what we have now. But it used many of the principles that we now find in chatbots like ChatGPT. The idea of learning word vectors, embeddings for each word, and the idea of training the whole thing jointly to predict the next word given the previous ones. Then in 2014, my group introduced attention mechanism, which eventually became the masterpiece of transformers in 2017. And so there's really not that many ideas, and a few others like the ResNet architecture structure that explain a lot of the success we have now. Besides that, of course, the big factors in the improvements in capabilities have been with the size of the model, so compute power, and the size of the data sets that we didn't have in those days.
Right. I think just to make it concise and simple for many listeners, one of the reasons why AI systems are so powerful today is just three main pieces. As you said, the computer power, the data, and then the algorithms themselves. And what you're saying is that the ideas behind it, like almost the intellectual structure of how to build these things, has been around for a while. But is it sort of that we needed the computer power and easily accessible data to catch up?
Yes. And I would add that in the very early days of deep learning, so I'm talking about 2010 around-ish, it was very clear that one of the main reasons for the improvements we were seeing compared to years before of neural nets was because suddenly we had access to larger data sets like ImageNet, and GPUs were around. These are the 2000s are the early years of GPUs. In fact, in the 90s, when I was trying to train neural nets for pattern recognition, I already had the empirical observation that the bigger the network, the better, and that it was actually difficult in terms of, with the compute resources we have, to train these neural nets to even minimize their training error. So it's something that I think probably many others have observed in many settings. This fact that, overfitting neural nets, in other words, overtraining them is not that easy. And you can train them and make them bigger and bigger, and you still see pretty good performance well before you reach the point, well, where they might behave badly, in other words, overfit.
Well, you mentioned GPUs, and again, just to clarify, those are the computer chips that are mainly driving a lot of this stuff. And if I'm not mistaken, a lot of that came from video game systems and how they were designed, correct?
Exactly. So these chips, graphics processing units, right? Their name says it. They were designed to perform matrix multiplications, which are very important and expensive in computer game rendering. But it turns out it's also the workhorse in terms of computation of deep nets. And we just rode on that. It's only like in the last few years that companies are starting to design their GPUs for AI rather than for graphics.
Right, which makes them all the more specialized. Well, I think I can then say when I was playing Street Fighter 2 and Mario Kart in the early 90s, I was contributing to the AI world that we have now. And then if we sort of go forward now to the recent, I guess, the 2020s, there's been dramatic increases in AI capabilities, not just with ChatGPT, but that's the one that everyone knows, which came out about a year ago now. And I wonder how you then see this recent development. I think initially perhaps with excitement and then maybe with increasing concern.
Exactly. I and others first saw the advances with generative AI that generates images. And as a parenthesis, my group introduced GANs in 2014, as well as other papers of generative models. There was work on generative AIs in deep learning, actually, for the last 2 decades. But it really became good at generating images when we started making those neural nets big and training them on more data. And that happened before the large language models kind of revolution we've seen the last year. So as you said, having systems that were good at generating images initially was quite exciting, and suddenly we thought, we are like really making a dent into the problem of understanding images. But we were also seeing the beginnings of deep fakes. So the questions of social impact and regulation is starting to increase in many people's minds. But one thing is to understand images, the other is to understand language. And this is the revolution that has happened this year, at least that became visible for people not working in the few companies building those systems. And that has really worried me because, as Yuval Harari has been saying, language is the operating system of our society. Language is the key to so many of our human activities and how we relate to each other and how we function in our jobs, in our democracies, and how society basically work. So once you have AI that can get into that connecting tissue, well, it better behave in the good ways and morally speaking, otherwise we might be in trouble.
Right, and language is the key to unlock the world, so to speak. You raised several different interesting things. Before we get to some of those concerns, if we can go back just a little bit, you said GANs, which are general adversarial networks, and I think that might be useful to elaborate on, or even to help people understand just how are these systems so capable? How do they learn so much? It is machine learning, so somehow we've kind of outsourced the learning to the system itself. But if you could describe, for someone who's not so technically minded, just how they get so good.
Well, there's been efforts, as I said, to build generative models of images for at least 2 decades with neural nets, but they were quite crappy, the kinds of images that we're generating. And in fact, in our 2014 GAN paper, the images we were generating weren't that nice. But then other groups took the same methods and scaled them up and made some improvements on the architecture that somehow made it easier to train. And we started seeing incredibly faithful and realistic images each year, getting better and better, mostly by a few little tricks, but mostly by making those networks larger. It's like, the way I understand this is the world is complicated, like the world of images is complicated. And if you don't have a neural net that's big enough to capture that complication, well, you're going to get crappy images that is trying to imitate real images. But if it doesn't get it, how objects in the world are, in fact, in 3D, because even though it generates 2D images, in order to really be good at generating images, you need to understand the 3D structure of images. And of course, people have been generating 3D things as well since then. But my point is, the world is complicated, and you need big networks with reasonably good training objectives in order to capture its distribution. So what we call its distribution is how the different variables here, pixels, are related to each other. And that's very complicated. And we can't handcraft an answer to this, but neural nets can essentially approximate any function, any distribution, if you make them big enough and you train them long enough.
So as you said, we can't handcraft it, but by using the methods and having enough data, and as you said, the depth, we can make, we'll say, enough mathematical associations between different variables in the broad sense to then generate outputs that we're seeking.
Yeah.
Great. And now you did say there's more recent concerns, which is certainly a lot of why people are in the news. Yourself, there's stuff going on at the UN. There's stuff going on from executive orders from the White House. So before we get into some of those specifics, maybe just give us the broader picture of why might people be concerned. You can elaborate on, as you said, if they're not quite doing what we want them to do. But from someone from the outset, like we're building these systems, surely we sort of know what they're doing and can control them. So why are people so concerned?
Well, I would say there are two fundamental reasons. One is, even if we knew how to control them, they are tools, and as they become more powerful, they can be used for good or used for bad. So this is the dual-use nature of almost every technology.
Right.
But as the technology becomes more powerful, the chances that the malicious users could be dangerous for society and people becomes greater. So if those neural nets that are big and know a lot of stuff get in the wrong hands, they could be misused for disinformation, creating weapons for warfare, cyber attacks, all kinds of things that we don't want. So that's one reason, like misuse, basically. Which would happen even if we knew how to control them. The other problem is we don't know how to control them. As they start learning more complicated kind of implicit model of how the world works, we haven't found a way. In other words, science doesn't know how to make them behave as we intend. This is called the alignment problem, which means even if you're, of goodwill, you might put out something that can harm people. And if those systems become more powerful than us intellectually in sufficient areas like finance, cybersecurity, convincing people, they might behave in ways that could be, extremely harmful and not according to what we would consider morally okay or aligned with our social norms and laws and so on. And that's the second danger, is the danger of loss of control.
I think that's a great sort of quick analysis on these two main issues. In my book, I sort of have three breakdowns, right? You have misuse, as you said, or the machines, we can't really control them, but there's also accidents, right? They don't quite do what we want in a certain different type of way. But if we manage to make an AI, as you said, that does what the, say, designer or the creator or the user wants, there's this whole other conflict between different users, different people, different countries, different malevolent actors, that it does really create this very difficult problem, which is not, again, a new problem to AI. It's kind of just a problem in the world. People disagree about what they want. Some people want to harm others or exploit them, and AI will probably make that easier. And then there'll be a bit of an arms race between people using AI to stop other people using AI. And it does certainly not fill one with a lot of hope or optimism, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a lack of hope or optimism. So I wondered how you sort of conceptualize where does the optimism might come from if we're currently building systems we don't fully understand, and the more powerful they get, the more harmful they can be.
Well, I don't care much about, whether one is optimistic or pessimistic. I think what matters is what can each of us do to move the needle in a better direction. And so I think there are lots of things we can do, especially collectively, in other words, through governments. We can make sure that we ask companies to demonstrate that their systems are safe, will not harm people before they're deployed. That's an example of the idea behind regulation. this is what we do already in many other sectors. It's like computers and AI have been, evolving without any oversight from governments because those tools maybe were not considered to be too dangerous. But we are entering that zone where I think it's urgent that we fix that. So that's an example of what we could do. The other things we need to do. So one of them is do research, a lot more research to understand what can go wrong and how to mitigate those issues. So as I said earlier, right now we don't know how to program these systems so that they behave according to our intentions. And I think that we should invest public money, but also create incentives for companies to work a lot harder on making those systems better aligned with our values. Whether it's human rights and discrimination or misuse or loss of control, these systems, if we can't make them behave well, and if they have enough agency and power in the world, they become dangerous. And we need to make progress on that. There's a third thing that I've talked about in a paper for the Journal of Democracy and also in my testimony to the US Congress, which is that we need to prepare in case our regulations come too late or not sufficient or imperfect. No regulation or treaty is 100% efficient. So we need to also consider how society can defend itself if or when powerful and malicious AI systems, maybe with people behind or not, start being harmful and dangerous for society.
That's a great series of three. Maybe I might take them in reverse order. So thinking about the last one, I fully agree, and I think it's the right approach for such a potentially dangerous technology. In my book, I talk about the principle of defense in depth that should underlie all policy proposals. And that's just the idea, as you said, that you have multiple layers of defense where you're not expecting any one thing to succeed, and you may actually be expecting it to fail. So you have all these counterbalancing measures. And I think without that perspective, we run the risk of greater harm. For the second one, with the AI safety research, is sort of like the broad category of what we might call it. I wondered what you think are the current most, say, promising opportunities, because I think people generally think transparency is good, understanding how these systems work is good, but it also seems that by the very nature of how they're created, we don't fully understand how they work. So is there anything in particular that you think seems like a good path for that type of research?
Yes. So first, let me comment on the current methods that are being deployed in companies building these systems. That's the best we can do right now. In other words, we're trying to test them in many circumstances, and then we have teams of people trying to find context where they would behave badly so that we can patch them and make sure in these contexts they're going to work as intended. But of course, it's not satisfying, because we can't test every possible scenario, every possible context in which a system will be used, including in case where the systems are, the weights are shared, including the possibility that the malicious user continues training them. This is called fine-tuning towards a malicious intent, which is going to be very difficult to protect against. So what could we do? Well, I think that we should strive to develop AI systems, maybe using principles very similar to the current neural nets, or maybe something different. We need to open the door to every possibility so that we can have stronger safety guarantees. That we could say something like, we can, like what people do for bridges. Before you build a bridge, you have to demonstrate to local authorities that it's not going to fall. Or what pharma does, before they deploy a drug, they run some tests, and from that they can deduce statistical evidence that the product is not going to be toxic for the vast majority of people, and so on. So we do this, when we build a nuclear plant, and we don't have that for AI, and we wouldn't even know how to do it. But I think there are ways to do it. At least we should explore those ways. And well, that's kind of a research program in itself. In my opinion, I could spend more time on how it might be done, but a lot of it has to do with the need for these systems to understand that they don't know everything and that they need some sort of humility or what's called epistemic humility or epistemic uncertainty. So they know that they don't know. So if a particular action they might take is something they're not sure is going to be safe, then they should not take that action. Even though, it may look like in most cases it should be fine. If the probability that something bad happens is above a very, very small threshold, then they should not act. And in order to do that, they need a kind of self-knowledge that humans can have. Like when we think about something, we observe a sentence, we have a sense of how plausible that is, how much we can trust that statement. And right now, we don't have a good handle on that. And this is the reason why these large language models, for example, will hallucinate, meaning they can be saying something wrong with a lot of confidence. And of course, that's very dangerous. If it's not just about saying something, but doing something, that could be dangerous. If the system is sure that there's no problem, it will do, what it thinks, what it produced, and not be kind of taking into account those dangers. And that's what we want to avoid.
So would you say that there's a similarity between solving the problem of having, say, a language model verify that what it's doing is correct and being able to verify that what it's doing is right? By correct, I mean not hallucinating and not giving false facts and making things up versus, doing good for humanity being non-dangerous.
Yes, there are very clear connections between the two. Initially, we will, as people are trying to do now, try to design those systems so that they can't be easily misused for purposes we know are nefarious, like building a bomb or designing code that can take down some of our cyber infrastructure. But ultimately, of course, and we're not there, as these systems get to understand better how the world works, our society works, how humans, psychology works, and so on, they'll need to understand ethics. They'll need to understand what is morally good and morally wrong, which is complicated and something we don't know how to spell out clearly. But this is where they need to go. And while they're doing that, as they get better, it's going to be very important that they always have this epistemic humility, that they be conservative in their actions, so that when they're not sure that it's okay, because they don't have enough information, enough training data, or enough knowledge about a particular domain, they just don't do it.
Well, given that we do a science and critical thinking podcast, we're definitely fans of epistemic humility or cognitive humility. But couldn't you say that if an AI has epistemic humility, it's not going to pass the Turing test because many humans don't?
I don't care about the Turing test as such in terms of safety. In fact, I don't think it's a good idea to try to build AI systems that are like copies of us. For example, if an AI behaved, at least superficially, through our interaction, like in the Turing test, behaved like a human, we might attribute to that entity moral rights, and we might find it normal that this AI system has a self-preservation objective, just like every living being on this planet. But that would be extremely dangerous. So if these entities just go for their self-interest, that might not correspond to our self-interests. For example, if humans want to turn off the machine, well, the self-interest of the machine is to avoid that. And how can it avoid that? Well, there are many ways. It could convince us not to do it, or it could copy itself, and probably do both, in many other computers, so that if we turn the machine off, well, it still has copies running in other machines. These are just examples to show that when there are different self-interests, there is a potential for conflict. And if those machines are more powerful than us in enough ways, and we could lose that conflict. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty about all these scenarios, but we don't want to get anywhere close to these scenarios.
Right. And I guess for things like that, which are sometimes called power-seeking behaviors, maybe it's deceptive or it can manipulate people, or as you said, hide copies of itself and trick humans in various ways. Are things like that why basically some people say there's an extinction level threat? I believe you were one of the signatories to this statement that came out in May 30th that says, we have to mitigate AI level risk like nuclear weapons or pandemics. And this word extinction does get talked about a lot. And actually the leading AI labs all say there's an extinction risk. So I think someone at home is so confused almost, right? If there is an extinction risk, why is everyone still building it? And so I wondered if you could share your thoughts on all that.
Yeah, this is a great question. So let me first qualify the extinction risk. There's a lot of disagreement in the AI scientific community about whether there is extinction risk. And the underlying reason is that we're talking about things that haven't happened in the past. It's hard to make a projection. We don't have statistics of machines taking over or being extremely dangerous. So, some people say, well, since we can't make models, like we can make models of climate about what will happen as we continue building more powerful AI systems, let's just not talk about it. And they often insist that we should worry about the current harms, and I agree. We should work on the current harms, which, by the way, have to do a lot with the alignment problem, human rights violation, privacy, discrimination. They're all problems of alignment. Now, my opinion, however, is that if we're not sure that something really bad could happen, and in fact we don't see any strong reason why it couldn't happen, and we see that we're moving in that direction, well, I think lots of red flags should be flashed, and we should be cautious. So if we go with the cautionary principle, given the information we have, and that a lot of scientists see that trajectory going into a place that could be very dangerous, I think the governments should protect the public. And in fact, when you ask people on the street, should we continue building machines that might be very destructive? The vast majority say no, and they want governments to regulate. So why is it that we continue going forward without knowing if we can prevent those potentially catastrophic outcomes? Well, it's very simple, because these systems could be extremely profitable. They could also be useful in important ways to help with medical treatments, even fighting climate change, of course, productivity. This is where you make a lot of money. And so there's a huge pressure to continue making those systems more capable, meaning more powerful, and gradually approaching and potentially passing human abilities. So it's a dynamics of competition between companies, lack of regulation, lack of international treaties that seems to bring us, more and more towards these more powerful systems that can thus be potentially misused or that we could lose control of in dangerous ways.
I tend to see it the same way. I think that, as you said, if the trajectory, given the current sort of models of if we invest more in computational power, new chips are more powerful, more data can be utilized, algorithms seem to be getting better, the most likely outcome is systems get more capable and more powerful. And if we don't know, it's much better to be prepared than to be caught off guard, given the stakes seem to be so high. Now, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty, but that uncertainty is not reassuring in any way whatsoever. And then, yes, when we have a lot of humans who like nice, shiny objects, people like the internet, their phone, social media, and then sometimes we come to realize that maybe some of these things aren't good for us in certain ways. But even those particular examples are relatively benign compared to something like, as the comparators are, like nuclear weapons or a pandemic, because AI seems so much more devastating if it goes awry. So I guess, do you partly see one of your roles nowadays when you're trying to raise awareness of this is to, I'm not sure about putting the brakes on the competition, but to try to shift how people understand this and whether they should be moving so fast with making all these new products in the first place?
Yeah, I think we should be cautious, and I feel like I have a duty to explain why, to speak up about those risks. You mentioned unintended negative consequences of technology. And I want to maybe comment slightly on this. So one of the risks that we haven't yet discussed is what people call systemic risk or systemic societal risks. So maybe a good example that people have been discussing a lot is social media. It was not the intention of the creators of social media that it would polarize politics or that it would maybe lead to different forms of abuse for disinformation and things like this. But something like this seems to be happening, and regulators are coming late after the technology is deployed. There is similar concerns that we may be using AI that maybe is not misused or maybe is well controlled and controllable, but could still be disruptive. So think about jobs. If those systems become gradually more capable in many domains, it's very likely that companies will use those tools to replace some of the work done by humans, which means many people might be out of a job, and that could create huge misery and social disruptions and political disruptions. So that's a very simple example that actually many people are worried of. But there are many other examples where we use more and more AI, and even if we kind of keep the safety issue under control, we might still, through the dynamics of society and competition, end up in a bad place.
Right. Well, that does make a lot of sense. It's sort of like even if things kind of work out like we hope, another problem might pop up like a whack-a-mole type thing. Before you mentioned other issues about algorithmic bias or even unemployment, and I just wanted to briefly touch on, it seems to be, or I guess I should ask, do you think there's a bit of an unfortunate division that's occurring between people who are concerned about different types of AI risk? I personally think there shouldn't be one because we're all kind of concerned about similar things, and a lot of the policies that can address, we'll say, current present harms could easily help bigger, larger, more existential harms. So how do you see that?
Yeah, I do think it's unfortunate because, so for one, I've been speaking up about human rights issues with AI and even the problem of manipulation due to AI-based advertising for many years, almost a decade now. So I don't see that there is a fundamental difference except that we're talking about harms that haven't happened yet in one case versus harms that are actually happening now. And both are important. Like, we need to stop what is wrong now, and we need to try to avoid harm that may come next year, in 5 years, in 10 years. So I see this as a continuum for which the solutions are essentially the same. We need democratic governance. We need to make sure that it is the people who decide how these tools are used, who benefits, make sure that there's not excessive suffering that's going to come from that, because we've seen in the past sometimes technology yields benefits for some people and harms many others. So what is it that should be considered sufficiently safe? I don't think it should be companies to decide that. It should be governments in democracies that are representing people's voice that decide, okay, so we're comfortable with that level of risk, or we're not comfortable with that level of risk, and then companies should oblige.
Earlier this month, at the beginning of November, the UK had a safety summit, and I know you were involved in that and various other side venues. I wondered if you could talk about what your experience was there, how you felt, I guess you thought there were some good ideas, maybe some bad ideas, and this notion of whether democracy can help us sort of tame the AI problem, if you felt that was moving in that direction, or there's other roadblocks, given, as we know, countries will often have different preferences.
Yeah, the UK AI Safety Summit was, I think, a historic moment where a large number of governments from around the world, I think something like 25, agreed on a few key principles about AI safety, that basically governments have to intervene to protect the people against the potential harms in order for everyone to benefit from the good side of AI. And out of that, there were, I think, interesting and maybe unexpected agreements about some of these questions. For example, China was represented there and agreed on those principles and shared a lot of the concerns. Of course, we know that maybe some of the reasons for the fear of AI in China are different from the reasons we may have in democracies. But still, the fact that we're on a trajectory to agree at an international level to follow safety protocols, I think is an amazingly good thing. There were also a lot of discussions that helped the different governments and individuals from different organizations, including civil society, to better understand each other, to get closer to each other, to converge to an understanding of what governments should be doing. There are still disagreements, but I think we've moved really in a very important direction. So this was an important event indeed.
Yes, certainly when I saw that China and many other countries all signed that declaration, it was, I won't say reassuring, but definitely a very positive sign that at least it's being publicly acknowledged this is such a concern and that hopefully more and more progress will be made. I think the next meeting is in South Korea in half a year or something like that.
Right.
When thinking about the upcoming future, I wondered if you could share, even though it might be highly uncertain, how you sort of see the next 2, 5, 10 years in terms of maybe AI capabilities or even some of the risks that might occur maybe in the near term or later, or maybe you just want to reject the premise of the question.
Well, I often say I don't have a crystal ball, but I think what we can do, I mean, clearly nobody can predict a particular trajectory. But we can see some risks are shorter term, and some are, slightly later. But of course, some people think we could reach AGI in 2 years, so that's kind of optimistic in my opinion. But who knows?
If you can clarify, what do you mean by AGI?
Right. So the letters stand for artificial general intelligence, and it's a term I didn't use until recently, but since so many people use it, I've decided to use it. But the general idea is we are on a path to build machines that not only can be as strong as us or even sometimes better than us in some specific narrow tasks, but become good at a much broader set of tasks and kind of general knowledge of the world, of the kind that, knowledge that humans have. And so that's what people mean by general artificial intelligence. And of course, there are still a lot of things in which the current systems are not very competent, including crucial things like reasoning. But there's clearly a movement in that direction. And that's so this notion of AGI, there's a term that I used in the past, which is human level AI. Mm-hmm. AI that is performing essentially at the same level as most humans on most tasks. So a crucial part of making these kinds of predictions is when is it that we're going to reach more or less like human competence. So now, of course, different humans have different levels of capabilities. And another factor I think people don't talk about enough is in terms of safety. We don't actually care if the AI is surpassing humans on everything. It's enough that it surpasses us on some key capabilities that it can use to create harm. So, for example, if it can make a lot of money on the financial markets because it understands how to bet on these things better, it can accumulate economic power. If it understands through experience, for example, in social media, how to influence people's opinion, well, it can accrue political power. It can have political influence that hopefully wouldn't happen. If it progresses on the ability to program, and in particular cybersecurity, it could become threatening for our infrastructure. And we've seen that those systems are still not as good as the best programmers. And in general, the current system are not as good as the best programmers, the best biologists, the best chemists, and so on. But they are making progress every few months. And so when they become good enough, not even necessarily superior to human at something, so it could be that they're as good as some of the best humans, for example, at designing a bioweapon. Well, that's already very dangerous because right now, very few people in the world can design a bioweapon, like a pathogen that could kill lots of people, like, create a new pandemic. Mm-hmm. But if it's easy because we just ask the machine, and after we've removed the safety protections, and it tells us how to do it, well, then any small terrorist group could do it. And that's scary, of course.
Yes, very much so. I think when I sort of think of it, it's a bit of a continuum, right? That a human, which is not that capable, can still cause a lot of harm. And then the more capable a human is, the more harm it could cause. And as you said, it doesn't have to be capable in all sorts of domains. Right. The reason why a lot of harm is, caused in the world is not because some malevolent actor was like also good at poetry. It's just not as relevant as what they're trying to achieve.
Exactly.
As for the bioweapon stuff, I know sometimes people say, oh, well, a lot of this stuff is available on the internet. But I think a lot of people might underestimate just how important it is that the easier it is to do something, the more people will do it. And that usually includes committing crimes. That if you just make it a little bit easier, and people are more likely to do it. And with these systems, if it gets to that, really good conversational level with this very sophisticated entity, what do I do next? Oh, what do I do next? And then it really walks you through step by step, as they say, this thing which Google or another search engine couldn't have possibly done.
Yeah, and also if anybody in the audience who's not, say, a biologist opens real scientific papers in a field that they're not familiar with, like say how to do synthetic biology of new living beings, these papers are very difficult to read if you're not an expert. It's just full of jargon.
Oh, yes.
And it's the same, by the way, in any field of science. And so even if the information is out there, it is kind of encoded in a way that only a few people understand.
That's an excellent point. Yes, for many of these disciplines, I can't even understand the titles of these papers. Or, you get the 4 English words that I'm recognize, and then it's the jargony, a reference of a certain molecule or a certain process that's a lot less familiar. One of the current debates in the whole AI space is whether to have systems that are more closed or open. We know open source has been sort of great for scientific development, people sharing, right, their ideas, their research, and that has also helped build numerous technologies. But with something so dangerous like AI, at least some people argue, that it shouldn't be so open, it should be more closed. And I wondered what you think about that.
Yeah, this is a raging debate, and there are strong disagreements. So let me lay down some of the main points here. So first of all, I've been a proponent of open source for all my career for the reasons you cited, progress, essentially, faster progress. But it's not an end in itself. We also need to put in the ethical balance, say, harm that could come out. And when we consider AI, by the way, you can say the same thing about the biological knowledge to create pathogens and the biological equipment to create pathogens, or the physics knowledge to create a nuclear bomb, and the nuclear equipment, like materials that are needed. So there are things that there are technologies, because they could be used for harm, especially if they're dual use. So they will be built for good, but then they could be misused, for which the answer to the question whether we should make them accessible to everyone is less obvious. And there is something important to understand about open source. Once we have made a model that's been trained and we share the code and the weights, anybody, including bad actors, can use it. And whatever law we put after that is too late. The information has been irreversibly given away to everyone, including bad actors. Another important thing to understand is that the decision to share something that could be dangerous for society should be democratic. And right now, the way open source works is for these frontier systems, there's just a handful of companies that can actually build them. And they will unilaterally decide whether they're going to share them with the world or not, including with bad actors. I think this is wrong. I think the democratic principle here should be that the people should decide, or their representatives, governments or civil society, academics who can provide advice on these questions. The other thing I want to mention is, because these systems are dual use, now they can be used, they can be weaponized, they can be used to harm. It doesn't make sense to make them accessible to everybody. It's maybe the techno-libertarian way of thinking. If you're talking about guns, Well, the libertarian view is that everybody should have one, and so we can, defend ourselves against the bad guys. And that's one way of thinking. But in most democracies, we've chosen a different path where we regulate. We say, well, we want to make sure that trustworthy people have access to dangerous tools. And AI is getting into that category. So it's not open source versus not open source. It's not like, oh, we're going to ban every open source. No, most technology, most software, most AI is not dangerous and should be open source because open source has advantages. But beyond a certain level, it shouldn't be shared. Also, some of the benefits of open source could be obtained without open source. So what are those benefits? For example, we'd like to have more researchers be able to play with those models so that they can find failure modes, which are going to help safety. But we can achieve that without open source by doing the same thing that we do in biology with BSL-4 labs that are for researchers playing with very dangerous pathogens. Well, only selected people that have the right knowledge and follow the right protocols are allowed to get into these places. And we could do the same thing here. We could create secured, structured enclaves where trustworthy researchers could play with those systems. In fact, on behalf of the people, to make sure they don't find something terribly wrong. So that's for the safety aspect. The other aspect is democratic governance. So it's true that by giving away the guns to everyone, we kind of share power. So it has a sort of democratic feeling to it. But as I said, actually, this is a decision that we should take democratically. And we also don't want to have concentration of power in the hands of just a few companies. And so these systems should be under very strong democratic oversight. In other words, the people should be able to see how they're used, if they're safe in the ways that we consider safe collectively, and if that power that they're giving is not abused. So there is a way to get that democratic component without necessarily having open source. In fact, open source is going against the right of society and in democratic societies of everyone to say, no, we don't want this to be given to everyone.
So many interesting things to follow up on. So I'll first say that, just to clarify for some listeners, that once a powerful model is in the world, as you said, people just have access to it. Now, even if this model has been trained or fine-tuned to be safe, it's relatively easy to fine-tune it out of that. So a company cannot just say, look, we did all this stuff to make it safe. Even if it escapes, it's fine. It just doesn't really work that way. And then with your analogy about guns, I guess the libertarian view might be like, well, there's the right to have it, right? Not everyone necessarily needs to have one, but there's usually some sort of licensing regime or process in place to protect people. And maybe the useful analogy there is, if someone develops a really powerful system, it is more like someone waving a gun in your direction, which other people don't have the right to do. And that's where the libertarian cause would be like, oh, wait a minute, someone is infringing upon my freedom, my safety. And as such, that doesn't really work. You also mentioned the biolabs, which I think is a good analogy, but I also know that there's so often very powerful biological material or dangerous substances that escape from these labs. That itself is not really reassuring, right? Because you have these, as you said, level 3, level 4 labs, and you're like, wait, anthrax got out again? And the amount of times this happens, I think would surprise most people hearing it, especially, there's some accident or someone didn't do something and it seems very basic, and yet it happens again like the next year or 5 years later. And so I agree that we need something like bio safety lab procedures. I also think those themselves should be a lot better.
I agree. And so one way to think about this, and in general about regulation of these powerful AI systems, is that it's a matter of proportionality. So in other words, the amount of control and oversight and the burden of protecting those systems so that they're not misused should increase with the level of danger. So previously I talked about like, oh, something is either dangerous or it's not. And, if it's not dangerous, sure, let's open source it. If it's not, if we want. And if it is, then we don't. But actually, there's a whole spectrum. And as we approach more powerful AI systems, we need to be much more circumspect and maybe decide not even to do it until we're fairly confident that it's not going to blow in our face.
That does seem to appeal to me more. Given the stakes, this whole, again, being cautious, being prudent, the facts that it often takes years or decades to solve a problem, as we're currently addressing, climate change stuff, and that's decades in the making. If we can just have a little bit more time to figure all this stuff out while we're trying to race ahead, makes a lot of sense to me. I wanted to pick up on the democracy angle. Certainly that also makes some sense, but do you have, I guess, some more detail or how you currently envision how it might work in principle? So say people say, okay, there's these powerful labs, whether it's OpenAI or DeepMind or Anthropic, or I guess Elon Musk has a new system and Amazon is going to have something called Olympus coming out. So it seems like all the big players, of course, are moving into this space. By what mechanism would, and which country, I guess, mainly it's the States because most of these are American companies, have some sort of democratic oversight and I guess enforcement to some extent over these companies?
Well, so first of all, it's not new for governments to have oversight on dangerous stuff. We have very strong regulation on food to make sure people don't die from, E. coli infestation in their food, and do it for, simple things like food, but of course, lots of technology like building, transportation devices, drugs, and so on. So we should at least apply the same sort of scrutiny. And because AI is going to be so powerful at some point, I mean, it's not clear exactly what speed this will happen, but the more powerful it will be, the more democratic oversight and democratic governance will become important. In fact, I even think that at some point we will have to innovate in the democratic institutions if we want democracy to survive the existence of such powerful tools, because anybody who controls a very powerful tool could be tempted to abuse it for their own benefit, to accrue even more power. And when that starts, we could all lose. And it's basically the opposite of democracy. Democracy is all about sharing power. When we have very powerful tools, we're talking about whoever controls those tools will have a lot of power. So we need to make sure that they can't abuse it. Now, how to do that? Like, I'm not a governance expert, but I think there's simple things. So one of them I've discussed in my Journal of Democracy paper is I think it's not sufficient for the oversight of these systems to be done by the government of the country in which this is happening. Because governments also could be corrupted. Governments could become, trying to exploit AI for their own benefit, political benefit, for example, and violate democratic principles.
I've never heard of any government ever being corrupted.
Yeah, well, and that's why I think we need to make sure that this democratic oversight includes civil society, includes independent academics, and even includes the international community, maybe through the UN or something like that. So you mentioned the fact that it's all concentrated in the US. So that's another kind of power concentration. If the US, in one way or another, decides to do something with AI that is going to create even more concentration of power in the hands of one country or the companies within that country, well, maybe the other countries don't find that agreeable, especially if it's at their expense. So they should have a voice. At least they should be able to see what is going on and then raise red flags. Now, how to do this? I think this is one of the things we do need to do put a lot more of our brains in. So one of the aspects, one of the challenges is research on the technical computer science, things like AI alignment. But also we need to invest as much on the social questions, the political questions, the governance questions, understanding what can go wrong at a social level, understanding what sort of mitigation, what sort of democratic institutions can best protect us. And we shouldn't say, well, democracy doesn't work, so let's forget it. That's the wrong answer. We have agency right now to build a better world. Let's do it.
I think that's a great sentiment. I certainly think we need urgent action on AI governance. And as you said, there are lots of humans on this earth, over 8 billion, and they all deserve to have some say in terms of how their fates are decided. It's not new that certain countries or certain companies that have, multinational reach and have billions or trillions in capital have a lot of outsized power. But it does seem even more concerning that, if AI is as dangerous as it might be, I know a handful of individuals in several different companies are having an outsized impact on the fate of the world. But yes, exactly how to do it? Well, we need everyone's help, right? This is why we need a lot more our efforts on AI governance and, as you said, the related social democratic issues. As we're closing up here, I'll ask if there's people that are interested in your work, where can they find you? And if you have any final thoughts you want to share.
Well, they can find me online easily enough. And I'd like to, find more people willing to work with me on finding these solutions. I mean, I'm a computer scientist, so mostly my efforts are going to be on the technical side. And I think every citizen has a voice in influencing our governments to take these questions seriously. For that, I think the best thing to do is to read up, try to think about it by yourself, and discuss it with others. And that people's will is important to get governments to move forward.
Let's make a better world. Thank you so much, Yoshua Bengio.
Thank you.
Thanks for all your great questions.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter @TRC_podcast.